When it comes to your retirement, do you want to have the same old plan everyone else has? Of course not. You're unique and have your own goals and dreams. Don't be treated just like a number. This is your retirement. So it's time to think differently. And you're in luck because you've found the Retire Your Way podcast with ILG Financial. At ILG Financial, you won't find generic, run-of-the-mill plans containing the same old cookie-cutter solutions. Dave Chase and the ILG Financial team focus on building one retirement at a time using their Think Differently philosophy. And that means your own comprehensive plan with customized solutions built to achieve just one goal, yours. So put on your Think Differently hats and get ready to take back control of your retirement today and for all the tomorrows to come. ILG Financial's Retire Your Way podcast was created just for you, and it's starting right now.
Welcome to the Retire Your Way podcast with Dave Lopez, founder of ILG Financial. My name is Ron Stutz, and I am pleased to be able to hang out with Dave for a while today, and we're both going to learn a lot. You listening to the show today, wherever you are, and me sitting right here with Dave. And Dave, I hope you've been well lately. It's been a while since we talked.
It has. I know Chase has run a couple of the podcasts, and it's good to have him take the reins on those. But I will tell you, it is good to be back. I enjoy this time together.
Well, I enjoy talking to either of you because you always do a great job with passing along all the information, and it's always a pleasure. So, hey, let's just jump right into today's topic, a brand new risk in retirement, sequence of returns. We talk a lot on this podcast about things we know are coming when we approach retirement. But today, Dave is going to talk to us about a brand new risk that is unique to those in or near retirement that they may never have even heard of or prepared for, sequence of returns risk. And Dave, why don't we jump right in? What exactly is sequence of returns risk, and why do so few people know about it?
Ron, yeah, thanks. This is really an interesting topic, only because time and time again when we meet people, it is amazing when we go over this new risk to them. It's not a new risk, understand. It's a new risk to them. It's called sequence of return risk. I would say, in general, 9 out of 10 people we bring it up to have never heard of it. Now, think about that. What else in your life that you have a real risk of incurring the wrath of something? Wouldn't it stun you if you had no idea it was even a risk? If you knew that your house was at risk of catching on fire, or you'd want to know about it, wouldn't you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Well, sequence of return risk is one of those risks that most people don't know about. Mainly, they don't know about it because it's never affected them in what we call the accumulation phase of their life. And we've talked about this before on the podcast, but, briefly, we kind of break down your investment life into 2 time periods. The accumulation phase, and roughly that's, think about age 17 when you got your first lifeguarding job or whatever you started, with your job mowing lawns to right up until about 5 to 7 years before retirement. In that period, usually 30, 40-year window, you're accumulating wealth so that you have money to live on in retirement. Agreed?
Yeah. Exactly.
So you're accumulating wealth. Well, the rules for investing, we would suggest in the accumulation phase are very different than the rules you will kind of live by or that will govern your investing in the second phase of your investing life, which is the distribution phase of your investing life. And that's from 5 to 7 years coming up to retirement, and then all of your retirement. So think the next 30 years.
Yeah.
And the reason the main reason is everything changes as you move into the distribution phase on the financial side. In the accumulation phase, Ron, think about this. I would suggest the rules are the same for just about everybody as far as the goals. And they would be these. Put in as much money as you can. Don't touch the money. And look for investments that over longer periods of time give you the best average rate of return so that you can grow your nest egg bucket as big as possible for retirement. Would you agree with that?
Right. Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. So everybody really has the same goals. Now that should make sense to you then. Why, when you talk to your friends or your family members or your coworkers, everyone has pretty much gotten the same vanilla advice for investing over the last 30 or 40 years of their life, which is, hey, look for good average rate of returns and look for investments that give you a better rate of return over time, and don't touch the money when the market's down. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, and we talk all the time about how everybody is unique, everybody's situation is different, and this is where all that comes into play when you transition into that other phase.
Where you hit the nail on the head. During the accumulation phase, you could argue that we are not that different, right? We have the exact same goal, which is to build up our nest egg as big as possible for retirement. And we're all not touching it. Most of the time, we're not touching it because the law has dictated that, right? If you put your money in your 401k, you actually incur a penalty if you pull the money out. So everybody's goal for their retirement funds are long-term savings over time. Now, what's interesting about, let's just swing back to sequence of return risk. Sequence, boy, that one's a tough one to say, isn't it? Sequence of return risk is a risk that does not, hear me clearly here, does not apply to you, does not affect you during the accumulation phase of your life. It doesn't exist while you're accumulating wealth. Make sense?
Okay, yeah.
Now, that explains why no one really knows about it. And that explains why their financial advisors never talk to them about it, because it didn't affect them. Sequence of return risk only affects you when you begin withdrawing funds, systematically, ideally. So let's really talk, it really doesn't matter why you're taking the funds out. You could be taking funds out because now you've hit retirement and you need $3,000 a month to cover the bills, right? Part of your budget. That's why you saved. You might need the money to come out for fun money, and you're pulling out money every 2 or 3 months for your vacation or travel or fun money, and that's why you saved it. Or if you don't need the money at all, you hit age 72, which is the current age for what they call required minimum distributions, or RMDs, and that may change moving forward to 75, but as of today, it's 72. And at 72, you have to take money out of your retirement accounts, even if you don't want to, starting at about roughly 4%. Now, what changes here is now that you're pulling money out, you are now susceptible to this brand new investment financial risk called sequence of return risk. Never existed before, right? And it can literally implode your retirement plan if things don't go as planned and it works against you. And I can actually kind of, give you examples of that.
Okay, well, Dave, it's hard to believe that this is not something that most advisors even talk about or bring up in the planning process. And as you said before, most people have no idea of this and don't really understand it. And I don't fully understand it at this point in your process of explaining it all. Why is it that this is such a strange concept, and why advisors don't talk about it?
Well, I touched on it a moment ago, but to be more direct about it, right up until you get ready to retire, right, or even in retirement, most advisors that folks are using are the advisors they had been using, which we call accumulation advisors. Yeah. And that sound familiar? I just talked about the accumulation period. So I call them accumulation advisors, and that's, again, this is not a hit on them at all. This is not a negative. Just something that we've experienced over time. It's the training. How they're trained to advise they're trained to advise folks for this accumulation period.
It's a different specialty.
Exactly. That's like, one doctor who specializes in heart have very different specialty than someone who's gastroenterologist, right? So both doctors, but completely different areas of specialty. So the accumulation advisor, I would suggest, is the advisor based on his training. He's giving you advice based on that accumulation phase, age 16 to age 55. Put in as much as you can. Don't touch the money. Look for average rate of returns over time to grow the bucket big. And don't touch it when it's down, and don't take money out. That's how they've been trained, and that's their advice. And then what happens is, as people move to the distribution phase, as you might guess, advisors aren't going to say, hey, you're moving out of my specialty. Go find another advisor who specializes in retirement or the distribution phase, right? True. Yeah. In fact, what we have heard from our clients is many of them will say, they just say, just do everything the same and it'll probably all work out. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So the reason people haven't heard about it is because many of the accumulation advisors have never had to address it with their client base, because the clients aren't in retirement. And they really never have had a lot of experience with it because they haven't been working with a lot of folks in retirement, or that's not their specialty. But it is crucial crucial that you understand it because it will affect you whether you've been told about it or not. And it doesn't matter if you come back later and say, why didn't a professional tell me about this when you're out of money? Mm-hmm. Okay. So one of the things when we talk about this risk is that it specifically will affect investments that you have in risk assets. Now notice I didn't say risky there. By risk assets, all I mean is risk assets have the potential to go up in value, of course, which is why you invest in them, but they can also go down in value. So an example of that would be stock or, technically real estate could go down in value or gold could go up or down in value, whereas something like a CD couldn't go down in value, right? That's guaranteed. There's plenty of vehicles that won't go down in value.
I'm with you.
So sequence of return risk affects only investments that are on risk. So one of the things that it makes this most critical to be cognizant of right now as you're moving into the distribution phase, or if you're already retired, it's not too late. You want to kind of look at this now, is there can be severe consequences if the markets don't accommodate you, meaning they don't act the way you hope they do during your withdrawal period, your distribution phase. So if things happen like more volatility than you're hoping for in the stock market, right, or prolonged down periods early in your retirement, it could be devastating. And what we're coming up on now, look where we are now. We have a combination of high inflation of the recording of this podcast, war in Ukraine. Goodness gracious, we don't know how far that's going to go based on the rhetoric that we're hearing on both sides, right, of the geopolitical world.
Yeah, such a sad situation too. And,
right. Right. You have impending high interest rates. As of the recording of this, the S&P is down about 10%. The Dow Jones is down about 6.5%. These are years to date. The NASDAQ has dropped about 18%. But more importantly, it is just impossible to predict where the market's going to go from here. It's impossible to predict what's going to happen to the markets on the short term, right? But what we do believe you can expect is continued volatility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And now the challenge is that sequence of return risk can affect you the most in periods of high volatility. So you want to be very clear about that. If volatility is high, your risk in sequence of return risk is going to be worse than in periods of low volatility.
And definitely volatility is going to be with us for a while, certainly. And let me step away just for a moment to remind everybody that you're listening to the Retire Your Way podcast with Dave Lopez, founder of ILG Financial. It's all about helping you plan for retirement your way so you can achieve your financial goals. If you'd like to get in touch with Dave, the number is 540-720-5656. I'll give you that number again a little bit later on in our conversation. But Dave, I know that there are lots of things that are worrisome right now with, you mentioned the war in Ukraine and everything else and everything being a little bit down. What is there to do about the risk? It may sound to some people that it's unavoidable, but can you do anything to mitigate that whole thing?
You can, and let's backtrack a little bit. But to start, let me tell you a story,
okay.
a real life story to try to crystallize exactly what this risk is. And then we're going to spend a little time here at the end of the podcast talking about what you can do. How does that sound?
Okay, that sounds good. I always love your stories too.
Yeah, this one is fascinating because frankly, it's one of the life stories in my life that drove me into this industry. Mm-hmm. My father-in-law, his name was Warren Chauncey, deceased, married my mom late in life. My brother and I, Andy and I, which is Chase's dad, were both adults when they married. And I'll never forget, Warren came to Andy and I and said, hey, listen, I just want you to know that I'm going to take good care of your mother. I've got her taken care of financially. Mm-hmm. When I die, I've got money in the stock market she's going to have. We've got equity in our house that she'll have to help her. And I've got a huge insurance policy, so don't have to worry about her.
Yeah,
and we said, Warren, that is wonderful. We appreciate you saying that, but tell me, are you going to be okay? What if something happens the other way? And he said, well, don't worry about me. I'm going to die at 65. Can you imagine?
Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think Andy and I said to that? We said, well, I got to hear this story. How is it your day to death?
Yeah.
Warren was one of 5 siblings from a large Chicago Irish Catholic family, right? Mm-hmm. He was the youngest of the 5 siblings. All 4 of his brothers and sisters, at the time he told us this story, had contracted adult-onset diabetes, and Ron, and all 4 of them had died, interestingly, at 65.
Wow.
Huge coincidence, right? But certainly some genetics going on there.
Yeah.
At the time Warren tells us his story, he is not yet 65. I think he was about 62 at the time, or 63, overweight, and had already been diagnosed with adult-onset diabetes. Mm-hmm. So you see where this story's going, right?
Yeah.
Well, shortly after that, a couple years after that, Warren hit 65, of course, did not die. And then shortly after that, Libby just could not shake a cough, Ron, that, she had chest cold or something, went to the doctor, diagnosed with lung cancer, and was gone in a year from the diagnosis.
Oh, no.
A year, gone. Now, why is this story important to what we're talking about today? Well, Warren lost her paycheck because they had their whole retirement plan mapped out. She was going to work another 5 years and sock away money. Right. And then they were going to have 2 Social Security checks and all their saved money and their equity in their house and the growing stock market, and they were going to be fine. Well, he lost her income for that next 5 years that he was counting on, right? Mm-hmm. He also lost her future Social Security check that he was banking on.
Yeah.
Now, what did he have to replace the loss? I'll tell you this. He did not have life insurance on Libby. Do you know why?
Why?
Because he was sure he was going to die soon first, right?
Absolutely.
Why waste the money? So no life insurance, but now immediately he lost an income stream, didn't he?
Yep.
So he was forced to go into his savings to augment his income. Mm-hmm. And where was his money? I said at the beginning of the story, the stock market and equity in the house. That was his only assets, right?
Gosh, changed everything.
Okay. Guess when this was?
This was
2009.
Oh, my God.
Right? So, you've all been told, hey, your money's in the market. Don't panic. If it drops, just leave it. Yeah. Right? But this is one of my soapboxes. What advisors don't seem to address is how do you make that statement to someone at the same time you're telling them to invest their 401k or their IRA or just their savings in the stock market? And you haven't addressed if they'll ever need this money for an emergency that they cannot time. Mm-hmm. Right? So intellectually, Warren, like you and me, knew that when the market tanks, don't touch the money. But do you see here that at this point, he had no choice, right? He lost Libby's paycheck. He had to have some extra money. So he had and he couldn't get the money out of the house. I'll tell you in a minute. So he had to pull the money out of the market at the very worst time, right? And because the market had dropped and his account had dropped 40 or 50%, and now he's pulling it out, he quickly ran out of money. And even though, as we all know, the market did recover, it didn't recover for Warren because his money was gone before it recovered. Okay. Now, why didn't he pull money out of his house? That's where his other equity was, right? Remember he said he had equity in the house?
Yeah.
Well, what happened to the equity in everyone's house in 2009?
Well, it was not a good situation as far as equity in a house is concerned either.
It literally vanished overnight, and he couldn't get an equity line of credit because remember they were freezing him. So he had to take the money out of the market at the worst possible time. He ran out of money, and the end of the story is, unfortunately, it is not it's a sad story. He ended up living the last several years of his life on one Social Security check. Eating out at McDonald's once a day. Yeah. Going to the mailbox every day, checking for a foreclosure notice to see if he was going to be kicked out of his home. Now, luckily he was not. A lot of people, if you remember back to 2009, the nasty secret with the banks was they didn't foreclose if you paid the electric bill and the gas bill and mowed the lawn because they didn't want the house, right? But didn't change the fact that if you weren't paying your mortgage, every day you were stressed that you were going to be evicted from your home.
Oh, exactly. That's no way to live. That's
no way to live. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Running out of money, Ron, before you run out of life, the loss of self-esteem, the stress involved in that, it's the worst case scenario for anyone who spent their life saving for retirement.
There's an old song that says that life goes on long after the thrill of living is gone, and that certainly applies in this situation.
Is that Mellencamp? Boy, we're getting old if we both know that one.
That was Jack and Diane.
Yes, it was. So here's why I tell you the story. This is a perfect explanation of sequence of return risk. Sequence of return risk. Now that I've told that story, I'm going to give you the nuts and bolts of it. Basically, it's the math that says, if you are told, hey, over 10 years, this investment has an average rate of return of 7%, okay? Right. And another guy has another investment, and he's over 10 years averaging 7%.
Okay.
Even though your returns over those 10 years are completely different, the point that you have an average rate of return over 10 years means at the end of the 10 years, if you didn't touch the money, you'll both end up with the same amount of money. It doesn't matter that the order of the returns were different. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense.
Okay. So sequence of return risk, if you're not touching the money, average rate of return means you're going to both end up with the same amount of money. What changes is the minute you start withdrawing money, sequence of return hits in and means average rate of return no longer matters, Ron. What matters now is the order the returns come in.
Okay.
Okay. Meaning you could have two different portfolios that average the exact same 7% return, average rate of return over 10 years. If you're both taking out 3 or 4% or 5%, one of you could end up with, still more money at the end of the 10 years than you started, and the other person could go broke just because the order of the returns was different.
Yeah, I get it.
Now, that's a little hard to say over the radio, but I want to let you know that I wrote a chapter in our best-selling book, Mama's Secret Recipe for Retirement Success. And if you want to get a copy, just reach out to the office. We can get it, or we can actually send you an e-version of that chapter. All you have to do is ask us for it. And it walks through an example of sequence of return risk, even showing numbers. If you're a numbers person like me, to how you could all you do is shuffle the different interest rates, the returns you get over the different years, and everything else is exactly the same, and you would come out with a very different outcome. But the point is, it kicks in because you're withdrawing money. If you're not withdrawing money, you don't have sequence of return risk. So if you've got accounts, if you're listening today, if you have accounts and you're withdrawing money or you plan to start withdrawing money on them, understand you may be subject to sequence of return risk. So it comes to your original question, long way around here, Ron.
Yeah. What can you do about it?
What can we do? The good news is there's absolutely stuff you can do. The first step is realizing that the risk even exists, right? Right. Now that you know it exists, you can identify if it affects you. So I would argue it doesn't affect any of if you've done any planning, or if you're with us, you've done this. If you're not with us, you may have done planning in retirement where you're encouraged to separate your investments or into different buckets based on how you're going to use the money, right? Another difference about the distribution phase. So you might have one bucket that's you're setting aside in case you need it for long-term care down the road. You have another bucket you're going to use over the next 10 years for fun money in the kids' weddings. You've got another bucket that you're going to use every month for income. Get the idea?
Yeah, it's important to have all those different buckets.
Yeah, and the reason it's important is, and this should make very clear sense to everyone, based on what I just told you about those three buckets, doesn't it make sense, Ron, that they would be invested very differently?
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Now, so right there is the best definition of why I say all the rules change between the accumulation phase and the distribution phase. In the accumulation phase, you could argue you had one bucket, right? And the bucket was leave it for 30 years and grow it as big as possible. Mm-hmm. Now, in my example, you've got three buckets for three different uses, money coming out in different times, different levels of risk are necessary, and even different levels of liquidity or access are necessary. So sequence of return risk, you don't have to worry about if it's a bucket you're not going to touch. So you may have a bucket that you think, hey, this is for security, but I'm never going to need it. I've got long-term care taken care of. I've got income and fund money taken care of. This is a bucket we're going to grow, and we're probably going to give to the kids. We're probably never going to touch it. And if it's ever down, we certainly will never touch it. Mm-hmm. That's a bucket that you could leave in the market, right? Because unlike Warren, if the market tanked like it's doing as of the recording of this podcast, you just leave it and leave it 10 years if you want to. And that goes right to what Warren Buffett said. And we've said it before on this podcast. If you're not willing to leave your money in the market untouched for 10 years, and here's the caveat that he says that people don't hear. For 10 years, no matter what, you shouldn't have your money in the market for 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, most people hear that and they forget the no matter what. And they think, well, I couldn't control, Libby dying. Yeah, I know, but that's still a no matter what.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we don't want money in the market if we need to take withdrawals from it, because especially if you can't time the withdrawals, because you can't time the market. So the money in the market should be money you're willing to set for 10 or 20 years. So it might be money that you don't need now that we're going to turn on for income maybe, or for fun money, or just use for living expenses 10 or 15 years from now. But the money for the next 10 or 12 years that you need, You don't want in any investment that can fluctuate negatively. That's just the math of sequence of return risk.
You know, Dave, one word that keeps coming into my mind as we have this conversation, and it always does, but particularly on today's podcast, is strategy. There is so much strategy that is involved with retirement planning, and you are better at that than anybody I know. And if someone is not using a certain amount of strategy and putting all these things together, that's a real mistake.
Thank you for saying that. And if there's one takeaway from all the podcasts we do, we've, I think, talked about it today as succinctly as we have in any other podcast, which is the rules change as you enter or get near to entering retirement. And most of you have never gone through retirement and you're going into this blind. We've done it hundreds of times. Mm-hmm. Right? If you're going into something for the first time, please get a coach, somebody who's done it hundreds of times. You don't have to take their advice, but you just want to know what you don't know. So to this sequence of return risk, I know, Ron, you asked me for some takeaways.
Yeah.
These would be the great way to close out the podcast with the takeaways for this. One, start by having a very clear understanding of how much cash you're going to need in retirement. You want a realistic budget of what you're going to need to cover your bills. If you want fun money, put that in there. Let's get a number on that. But, how much you're going to need, not just for monthly living expenses, but also one-time expenses. Like in 2 years, I want $40,000 to buy my dream car or to go on a vacation. Mm-hmm. Once we have those numbers, we can build a plan around it, right? Then we need to take an assessment or an inventory of all your income streams, right? A pension, how many pensions, Social Security checks, how many Social Security checks? Any other residual income like rental income, or if you wrote a book, are you getting a residual on a book or anything like that? Are you a movie star with a residual, right? Most folks, it's pensions and Social Security, right?
Right.
And then if we are taking money out of the 401k to augment the Social Security and the pension, if we are taking money out of the IRA or any account, that money is subject to sequence of return risk. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand it now. Yeah.
Right. So that bucket needs to be invested very deliberately to avoid sequence of return risk, to avoid what happened to Warren. He ran out of money because no one told him about this one risk. He thought he did everything right planning on retirement. No one told him about this. But you can't go back and do it over just because no one told you.
Yeah, that's
right?
For sure.
So know your numbers. Right? If you want help with those, we can help, right? It starts with planning, right? If you're with us, you've done this. If you're not with us, give us a call, right? If you already have somebody or you're looking, at a minimum, please find a fiduciary advisor, but one who specifically specializes in retirement planning and this distribution phase.
And if there's any confusion about what fiduciary means, it simply means you find an advisor who has your best interests at heart. And that is a good way to describe Dave Lopez.
Well, listen, I appreciate it. And one more reminder, if you do want just more information, if you're a reader, please call the office and ask for that e-chapter from our book on sequence of return risk. Megan or Michelle will be glad to send it over to you. And then after you read it, we can even set up a phone call and say, okay, I read it, Dave, and here's my questions, and let's really talk about how it affects me. We are glad to help. That's why we're here.
Well, Dave, let me just say it's been a pleasure spending time with you today, and certainly this sequence of returns risk is something that a lot of people haven't thought about. I think I'm safe in saying that, and you did a great job explaining it all. So
well, I appreciate you hanging with me. It's a lot of times when you're talking about math concepts, boy, it is hard on a podcast or a radio because you can't see it. So if that's you and you're listening today, you're not alone. It's a difficult topic to talk about without looking at it. That's why I want to make sure if there's the whole goal today was if you saw, hey, this if it even might be a risk to you and you don't know, that's a reason to check into it. And you can call us to check into it.
Yeah. Listen, you can find out more by going online to ilgfinancial.com. That's ilgfinancial.com. Information about a lot of things that we should all know. But the best thing to do is call this number, 540-720-5656. That's 540-720-5656. It's all about income, legacy, growth, and it's all right here at ILG Financial with Dave Lopez, Chase Lopez. You've been listening to the Retire Your Way podcast. I'm Ron Stutz, and we hope you will be with us next time.
The information provided is for educational purposes only and is not intended as investment advice for any individual or entity. All information contained herein is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. The views presented today are those of Dave Lopez and do not necessarily represent the views of the Alpha Star Capital Management, LLC. The opinions expressed are subject to change without notice and do not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice. Please consult your financial professional before executing any financial strategy. Investment advisory services offered through Alpha Star Capital Management, LLC, a registered investment advisor. Alpha Star and ILG Financial, LLC are independent entities. SEC registration does not constitute an endorsement of the firm by the Commission, nor does it indicate that the advisor has attained a particular level of skill or ability.